Now the story of the Jewish exiles who lost everything, and the one man who had no choice but to help them rebuild it. It's the book of Nehemiah. You ever watch a show or read something that you want to recommend to a friend and they ask the obvious question when you tell them it's great and they should watch it or read it? They're like, well, what's it about? And then you start to explain it and you're like, dang, I'm not doing a very good job of this. It's a very complex plot, and that's kind of what makes it good, but I haven't really thought about the elevator pitch. I don't know how to boil this thing down. Look, you are not going to have trouble with that when it comes to selling your friends on the book of Nehemiah. This one is easy, almost as easy as that little Arrested Development bit that we did on the front end there. What you got is a situation where the Jewish people got taken into exile and everything got wrecked. Looks like they're done and gone to the world, but then gradually over the course of a couple of generations, they are allowed to rebuild the temple and start to rebuild themselves as a people back in Israel. But at the time that the book of Nehemiah starts, there aren't any walls around that city. And in the ancient world, not having walls around your city is a lot like not having a city at all. It's a sitting duck, and Nehemiah is heartbroken over the fact that there aren't walls around the city, and he knows the job will never be done and things will never be right until those walls are built. So he makes that problem his problem, and the book is about him getting those walls built in the midst of all kinds of serious opposition. And then there's some other important stuff in there as well that we'll get to. Okay, but in fairness, some of you are probably like, that was a pretty long elevator ride. You said it was simple. That was like 6 floors. And you've got a point. So let me see what it would be like to do the 1-floor version. Okay, I'm in the elevator. There's a ding. And then you walk into the elevator. There's not going to be any time for me to introduce you or anything. So just kind of a little friendly half smile and nod. And now I'm just going to presume to talk at you for 1 floor. And we're underway. The book of Nehemiah is about a guy who goes and tries to get walls built around the ancient city of Jerusalem because it didn't have walls, and it'd be a lot better if there were walls. Okay, bye. See? 1 floor. It was that simple. But like most great stories that have a very simple premise, it's the nuts and bolts of it. It's how it's built. It's the themes. It's the underlying stuff that makes it awesome. It's the stuff that we were talking about yesterday that makes it awesome as well, which is all the confluence of stories and other things that are all coming together to make that go. And we covered some pretty good ground on that yesterday. And today we're going to round out that confluence of stories. And then we're going to get into the actual, like the book, the words on the page in the book of Nehemiah tomorrow. Once again, quick programming note. We did 42 episodes at the beginning. The first 42 episodes of the Book of Esther, the previous series, are all about all of this stuff in mega detail. If you want that, you can go and chip away at that over there. But otherwise, here's the long story short version. As we discussed yesterday, you got the Jewish people, the Israelite, the Hebrew people. They make a kingdom. It's going okay for a couple of generations around 1000 BC, but then it breaks into 2 separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom, things don't go real well up there. They played their cards wrong. That represents 10 of the tribes of Israel. They lose out in 720-ish, between the 730s and 720s. They fall apart and they lose to the big bad mean Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah, representing only basically 2 of the tribes of the remaining Jewish people, they hang in a lot longer, but ultimately in 586 BC, they lose to the Babylonians. Now, Assyria, they got beat a few years before that in the late 600s, so they're gone. I mean, the memory's still there. Nobody likes them. Now Babylon's there. Nobody's quite sure what to make of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's a super capable, competent guy. He goes through some mild bouts of insanity, but for the most part, as ancient Near Eastern dictators go, he does a pretty good job, but his successors aren't very good at being kings, and they lose out to the Persians. Cyrus the Great comes along, conquers Babylon, and immediately is like, let's just be nice to people. And he lets the Jews go back and start rebuilding the temple. Well, we didn't talk about this little detail yesterday, and it's a very big one. Most of the Jews who are living in Babylon and Susa and Persepolis and Pasargadae and all these different big cultural centers, these cities that are prominent in the Persian Empire, almost all of them by percentage say no to Cyrus the Great. They don't want to go back and rebuild. And what are you going back to? The rundown dump. Every stone got knocked off of every other stone in Jerusalem. You're starting from scratch. Plus, other people have moved in there. The hill people have come down to occupy where the city of Jerusalem used to be. They're kind of happy that the Jews got run out of there and are not going to be super friendly anyway. There's no temple. It's like you're starting all of Judaism. It's like you're starting the whole Old Testament practically over again. And a lot of the Jewish people are like, I don't know, like I still think there's a God and everything, but I kind of like Babylon. I think I'll just stay put, let somebody else go rebuild that stuff. But according to the book of Ezra, 42,360 of them, so that's what it says in Ezra chapter 3, wow, that's a big chapter, verse 64. It says the whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337 men servants and maid servants. And they also had 200 men and women singers. They just brought 200 singers with them. That's a great idea for a road trip with 40,000 people plus. And they had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. In verse 68 of Ezra chapter 2, it says, when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. And from there, we start getting into this stuff in Ezra about the rebuilding of the temple. All of this is happening in the 530s, 520s, and finally in the 510s under the reign of Darius the Great. The temple is rededicated after a very difficult process. We'll talk more about that later on as we get into the actual text of Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, after that, you'd think things are going to be great, but as we discussed, no, not really. There's a whole genocide crisis during the reign of Darius' son Xerxes, but that's averted by the providence of God and the heroism of Queen Esther, a secret Jew who is at the right hand of King Xerxes, and her family member Mordecai. It's a cathartic tale of God's deliverance and God's power over the unfolding of political events. It's just great. That's what we did in the last season. Go and listen to all of that if you haven't caught it, because I think you should. You're going to have a lot of fun with it, but it's okay if you don't. You can do whatever you want. It's the internet. And then after that, Xerxes gets assassinated in his bed and is replaced after some dynastic crises by his son, Artaxerxes, who's a really good Persian king. He's great at it. We don't know a ton about him, but how things went during that time, the growth and stability of the empire is evident in other ways, and we'll talk more about that again as we get into the actual text here in the coming days. So let me just reset the timeline here real quick, since now we're to action time. The Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah in 586 BC. The Babylonians lost to the Persians in 539-ish BC. Cyrus let the Jews go back and start rebuilding, and a small minority of them did so in 538 BC. Finally, the temple is completed and dedicated under the reign of Darius in the 510s BC, and then Xerxes becomes the king of Persia in 486. All the Esther and Mordecai stuff happens in the late 480s and on through the 470s. Then Xerxes gets assassinated in probably 465 BC. Artaxerxes becomes king of Persia, and apparently Artaxerxes is real keen on the Jewish people. He's like, yeah, not only would I not want to kill them, like my dad's right-hand man wanted to. What the heck was with that? I think the Jews are great. I'd like to have one be my most trusted advisor. And so when we open the book of Nehemiah, what we discover is that just like its predecessor book, Esther, there are still Jewish people in very high positions of influence within the Persian government. Now, of course, under the reign of Xerxes, you got the right-hand man, the vizier of the king at the end of the book of Esther is Mordecai. He's very, very, very Jewish. They got streets named after him in Israel still. And the queen of the whole empire is Jewish. She's Esther, unapologetically Jewish now. She's not even sneaky about it anymore. Everybody knows that positive momentum for the Jewish people living and thriving in exile rolls right on over into the reign of Artaxerxes, and he's now got a Jewish guy, Nehemiah, as his cupbearer. This is the guy who he trusts the most in his entire empire. A cupbearer, again, we'll talk about all of this more as we actually get into it deeper, but a cupbearer would have been more trusted a lot of times than your wife, than your queen, if you were the king. So that gives us a little bit of a sense of the moment we're in. Things are good. The Jewish people did not get eradicated. Persia, compared to the reign of the Assyrians or the times when the Egyptians were powerful, or compared to the Babylonians, this Persian Empire thing is great. This is the best it's been in a long time. The Jews seem to consistently experience the favor of the bureaucracy of these kings, even if at a couple of moments it gets a little bit touch and go. But what we discover is that the feelings, the sentiments of positivity toward the Jewish people that seem to exist in abundance as you get into the royal courts in Susa or the other capital cities of Persia, that positive outlook on the Jews, that does not extend. It diminishes the further away you get from the seat of power. And the province that is called Beyond the River, or the satrapy called Beyond the River, it's a division of the Persian, it's like a state of Persia. That's the one that has Jerusalem in it, and apparently there's a lot of people there, Persians in political leadership, there are local ethnic groups there, and kind of nobody likes the Jews. And they opposed the rebuilding of the temple. They tried to use bureaucratic nonsense to get in the way of all of that stuff. They've tried to use violence to oppose the rebuilding of the temple. And they've gone out of their way to make sure that the walls never happen around Jerusalem. Because as, again, we're going to discuss a lot more down the road, you don't got walls, you don't actually got a city. It might look like you have a temple, but that thing's a sitting duck, and it's just a matter of time until somebody comes along and wrecks it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things going great here during the Persian era of the Old Testament, but there's a lot of things that are still very, very vulnerable. And still, even as the book of Nehemiah opens, the more likely outcome for even a middling observer of the comings and goings of ancient history, a more likely outcome here would still be that Persia goes through a downtime or a weak spell, or another Haman administrative threat from within comes along and Jerusalem just folds. The temple worship goes away. The Jews get reassigned somewhere else, or they get wiped out by some raiders or bandits from the Greek city-states or maybe Egypt or something, and the whole people group is still just forgotten to history and goes away, even though they had a nice little run under Persia. That, to me, still seems the most likely outcome. You really want to set this thing in stone. You really want to establish the Jewish people and all the promises of God toward the redemption of the whole world that are attached to them throughout the Old Testament and from the prophets. If you really want to lock that in this moment in history, the key big next step is you gotta get some walls around that particular people group. If you don't have walls around them in this moment in history, it's just a matter of time. So the premise of the book is a lot more urgent than it might immediately seem to you or me as modern observers. Okay, I think we got a decent reset there on all of the confluences and how we get to this thing. I think that's plenty. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.